What's one of the things that you should be longing for if you're a Christian? Well, there's a lot of things that we're longing for in this broken world, but one of the things the Bible tells us we should be longing for is the return of the King. Part of God's great plan is to establish Jesus as King, and we know He's done that. He's actually ascended into heaven, Jesus, and He sits at the right hand of God, but He's not going to simply rule from heaven in a way that we can't see as clearly forever. He's actually going to return and establish a kingdom here on earth. And the Old Testament, part of the Old Testament's purpose is to help us understand what kind of king Jesus is going to be. And the book of Samuel is one of the books that especially helps us do that by, first of all, showing us the wrong kind of king, giving us a model of the king we don't need in Saul, and then giving us an example, an illustration of the kind of king that we do need in David. And we've begun looking at David in 1 Samuel, and we have seen that, first of all, God is looking for a king after his own heart. God is concerned not so much about the externals, but the heart. And then, second of all, we've seen that the heart that God's looking for is a heart that will trust God completely. We don't need so much a king who is known by his military might, but a king who is known by his faith in God's promises. And we rejoiced, in fact, as David stood up when no one else would stand up and defeated Goliath, not because he was strong. David actually tells us it's not about me and my might, but it's about God and his faithfulness. Now we've come to 1 Samuel chapter 16 as we continue to look at David and what David can teach us about the kind of king that we desperately need. So if you'll take your Bible and turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 18. We've moved past chapter 16, but to chapter 18, and we're continuing to see what made David such a great king. And David's victory over Goliath has caused everyone in Israel to take notice, and Saul has taken notice, and so has Saul's son, Jonathan. Now, normally in Middle Eastern culture, or really any culture, the king's son, how would he have responded to David's success? Normally he would have been suspicious, jealous, angry. Here's a contender for the throne. Instead of being angry, though, Jonathan loves David. The writer says the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This is a beautiful description of friendship. Jonathan made a covenant with David, and he showed his commitment to David by giving him his own robe and his own weapons. And besides developing this surprisingly strong relationship with Jonathan, David became a very successful soldier. We read in verse 5, David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul sent him over the men of war. And you have to ask yourself, is there anything that can stop God's plan from happening? No. Here David was an insignificant shepherd boy, and he's gone to the general of Saul's army in just a short matter of time. God doesn't have a problem establishing his king. And David becomes so successful that people start writing songs about him. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with instruments. And both Saul and David are being honored here, but Saul doesn't like the way they chose to sing about him. Saul has struck down his thousands, they sang, and David his 10,000s. If Saul were thinking straight, he would have been excited, because here David is going to war for him and is gaining great victories, but Saul is not thinking straight, and he becomes very angry, and he starts becoming worried that David would gain the kingdom. Saul's agenda is not God's kingdom or his people's good. Saul's agenda is his agenda, and that's the agenda of any worldly king. That's not the agenda of the proper kind of king. The kind of king God's going to send is the kind of king who is zealous for his people's good. Now, what is the reason that David has become so successful? How's it been possible for him to go from being no one to someone who's actually causing the king of Israel to be afraid? We discover his secret in chapter 18, verse 12, chapter 18, verse 14, and chapter 18, verse 28. What is it? Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. The point of this chapter is very clear. The writer makes it clear through repetition. David was loved by everybody, and he was a great success, not because he was important or from this powerful family, but because God was with him. And it's this very fact that caused Saul to hate him and to seek his destruction in ways that ended up doing damage to himself and to his own family. While that might be the main emphasis of this chapter, there are also other things here, and certainly one of the things that we can see is the way that sinful jealousy can destroy a man. David was doing nothing but bringing prosperity to Saul, and yet Saul's fear caused him to try to destroy David, using his own family as instruments to do so. Twice he tries to marry one of his daughters to David, not because he wanted his daughter's best, but instead because he was hoping that the Lobola that he set would cause David to be king. Actually, not king, but killed. And it's sad that David later is going to use a similar strategy in his life as he sends Uriah into the heat of battle so that he can have Bathsheba as his wife. But from a human perspective, it seems like David is in a very dangerous position. He's been identified by God as the next king. He has won a great battle for Israel. He's done nothing but good. And yet Saul, the king of Israel, who has great military might, is now set on destroying David. And yet chapters 19 and 20 show us how easily God can protect his servants. God has a plan. He will make that plan happen in spite of the devil's opposition. And the devil will rage against God's appointed king. He will use everything within his power to destroy God's appointed king. But God will protect him. And first of all, God raises up someone to protect David. Who is this person? You can see it in 19 verse 2. Jonathan, Saul's very own son, delighted much in David. The person most concerned for David is the one we would least expect. This is kind of like how Moses was rescued, actually, using Pharaoh's daughter. It's amazing how God often delights in rescuing his people in strange ways. And Saul's son Jonathan was given a great love for David by God. And so Jonathan warns David of his father's plans, and he defends David to his father. And initially Saul agrees with Jonathan, but it's not long before he's trying to kill David again. And at this time, David is saved through the daughter Saul had married to him. If you look back at chapter 18, verse 21, why did Saul marry Michal to David? Let me give her to him, he says, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So here's this woman whom Saul intended to be the means of David's downfall. But what does she end up doing in verse 11 of chapter 19? Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him. Sometimes God uses friendships to rescue his servants. Sometimes God uses the very thing that was supposed to harm us as the means to rescue his servants. And sometimes God uses extraordinary means to rescue his servants. In chapter 19, verse 18, David flees Saul and comes to Samuel. And when Saul hears of this, he sends a group of men to take David, but they come upon a company of prophets who are prophesying with Samuel at the head of them. And what happens to them in verse 20? The Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. When Saul hears of it, he tries again. And what happens to the messengers? He sends again in verse 21. When it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. He tries one more time. He sends messengers again the third time, and they also prophesied. So finally, Saul decides to go himself. And when he arrives, what happens in verses 23 and 24? And Saul went there to Naioth and Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. And as he went, he prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah, and he too stripped of his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it said, is Saul also among the prophets? You come after God's servant, and God has no problem humiliating satanic opposition to the messianic king. Again, with all this hostility from Saul, we might wonder whether David had done anything to deserve this. And David himself begins chapter 20 by asking that very question. Then David fled and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" Obviously, Saul was very up and down, and there were times where we see he promised not to hurt David, and other times where he was incredibly hostile towards David. And at this point, Saul was planning a new moon festival, and he expected David to attend, but David wanted to know whether it would be safe for him to show up or not. And so he entrusts himself to Jonathan, coming up with a plan through which Jonathan would signal to him whether or not his father intended to kill David. And in this chapter, Jonathan's actually a great example of loving friendship, because David is frightened and he has nowhere to turn except for the king's son. And so he turns to Jonathan, he enters into a covenant with him, and Jonathan shows steadfast love to him. Jonathan's an example of how we should feel about the messianic king, actually. And he puts himself in danger for David's good in verses 32 to 34. And we also see David's sacrificial commitment to Jonathan. Jonathan recognizes what God's doing through David, and he knows that David will become king. And what new kings normally do when they become king is they kill any rivals to the throne. And so Jonathan requests, "If I'm still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." And of course, we'll see that David honors this commitment. In spite of Jonathan's love for David, we see in chapter 21 that Saul keeps coming after him, and God continues to protect him. And David comes to a place called Nob, which was a mile or two north of Jerusalem and was the location where the main sanctuary was located at the time. And Ahimelech comes to meet David, but he's afraid because he knows of the problems between David and Saul. And David tells him a story. And he makes it sound as if he were there on a mission from Saul. David's on the run, and he's in the wilderness, and really he's being tested. His faith in God is being tested. And we don't know why he told Ahimelech this story. Perhaps he wanted to protect him. If Saul came and asked why Ahimelech helped David, perhaps David thought it would help Ahimelech if he could honestly say he thought he was helping Saul. Though Ahimelech doesn't have any ordinary bread, he does have special bread that was set apart for the priest, and he gives this to David, and he supplies him with weapons, the very weapon that David had taken from Goliath after defeating him in battle. And while this is a simple story, it shows that God is able to provide for David, even in the wilderness. And it also sets us up for seeing just how far Saul had fallen in the story that follows, because there was a servant of Saul standing there watching that day. His name was Doeg, the Edomite. Now from there, David flees to Achish, king of Gath. And this seems a little crazy because who was from Gath? Goliath. And what did David take with him? According to verse 9, David actually took with him the sword of Goliath the Philistine, who was from that very town. And we don't know what David was thinking. Perhaps he thought Achish would be happy to have one of Saul's greatest soldiers defecting to his side. He quickly began to worry, though, because the servants of Achish saw him and started warning Achish about him. And so David changes the way he's acting and pretends to be a crazy man, which causes Achish to dismiss him, saying, "Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come to my house?" Now, from this perspective, this story seems like it's missing God a bit. In fact, it sort of looks like David just escaped Achish by luck or by being clever. That's not how David looked at this situation, however. If you look at Psalm chapter 34, he describes this moment in his life. Psalm 34, the title tells us David wrote about the time when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, so that he drove him out and he went away. And David, when he talks about his deliverance, doesn't talk about his strategy of acting crazy, but when he talks about his deliverance, he says, "I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all of my fears." God is at work, even in these crazy circumstances. And after God provides food for David and rescues David from Gath, David escapes to a cave. And who joins David in this cave? According to chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And that phrase will come up later in the prophets. So try to remember that. But his brothers and all his father's house heard it. They went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And I'm not sure exactly what this text is telling us about the Messianic king, but it does seem to point forward to Jesus, doesn't it? In some way, at least. Jesus gathers to himself all who are weary and weak and sinful and know it, coming to him for forgiveness, and he becomes their captain. From this cave, David goes to Moab, and as he goes to Moab, we see David's heart. What does he ask the king in verse 3? David says, "Please let my father and mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." In spite of all that's going on in his life, he's concerned about the safety of his parents. And at first it seems a little strange that he would take his parents to Moab. But think about this. David had Moabite blood running through his veins. Ruth. Who knows, but perhaps God was planning all those years before David was born this unusual way of providing protection for him and his parents. It is a privilege to serve a God who knows all things and is planning thousands of years in advance. After this, we find David being instructed by a prophet named Gad, and Gad tells David what to do, and David does it. That's how kingship should work. The king was supposed to be submissive to the word of God. Our Messianic king, we know, is the word of God. The word became flesh, John tells us. That's how tightly connected our Messianic king is to the word. This is a reminder, though, as we look at David, that while he's king, he's not the final authority. It's his responsibility to submit to God. And we turn from David back to Saul in verses 8 to 23 of chapter 22, and we find a graphic picture of just how far Saul's sin had taken him. You see, he's become self-centered and petty, and he whines to the people, and he says, "Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that you all conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses that my son has stirred up my servant against me." And that sounds like a child having a temper tantrum, doesn't it? Not a king, but that's what our own sin does. It belittles us and humiliates us. And at this point, Doeg raises his hand, and after Doeg tells him about the way in which Abimelech had helped David, though basically leaving out the details in order to make Abimelech look worse in Saul's eyes, Saul went to Abimelech and killed him and all the priests who served alongside of him, 85 of them, as well as their family, men, women, children, infants. This is an absolute slaughter. You remember, Saul wasn't willing to do this when God asked him to do it against his enemies, but Saul is willing to do this when it comes to people he thinks are his enemies. And as Saul rages, we see him pushing himself further and further away from anyone who might support him. His anger has turned his son against him. His soldiers even refuse to follow him here. The only one on his side is Doeg, his chief shepherd. Though Saul kills everyone that day, there is one person who escapes, one priest. His name is Abiathar, and we see in David's response to Abiathar another contrast between him and Saul. First, David recognizes his responsibility. He says, "I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house." And second, where Saul is attacking God's people, David becomes their protector. He says, "Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping." This is what the Messianic king should do. He protects God's people. In chapter 23, David is on the run, and he hears about the Philistines attacking one of the cities of Israel, and he wants to go help, and he goes to God, and God says go, but his friends say no, and so he goes to God again, and God says go, and he obeys God. He goes and wins, and Saul hears where David is, and he wants to come attack him, so David goes to God again, And he asked, will these people give me up? And the answer is yes. And so he is going to be betrayed by the very ones he rescued. Amazing betrayal. So he leaves and he escapes to the wilderness, but Saul doesn't give up. Verse 14, Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand. And one of the things God's doing in the wilderness is training David to rely on him. This is why he took Israel into the wilderness. This is why he took David into the wilderness. But even though Saul is unable to find David in the wilderness because of God's protection, who does find him in verse 16? Jonathan. Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David, and he didn't have any trouble finding him. We see the way God is caring for David. What does Jonathan do? He strengthens his hand in God. And how did he encourage David? He says, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this. You can imagine how easily David might have become discouraged at this point. He rescued this city. They were willing to turn him over to be killed to Saul. And we'll see in a moment that the Ziphites actually went to Saul to tell him where David was. And David might have asked, is everyone against me? And yet just at that moment, God in his love sends Jonathan to remind him of his faithfulness. And not only does God encourage David at just the right time, God orchestrates circumstances to rescue David when he needs it most. In verses 19 to 29, when Saul hears where David is from the Ziphites, he blesses them. May you be blessed by the Lord, which is blatant hypocrisy, right? This is a man who just killed the priests of the Lord. Never underestimate the power of spiritual blindness. And Saul goes after David, and the text tells us he keeps getting closer and closer. He's on one side of the mountain, David is on the other side. But just as Saul and his men are closing in on David to capture them, what happens in verse 27 of chapter 23? A messenger came to Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land. And while we don't always understand God's working in this world, make no mistake, God is working in this world. He has a plan to establish his messianic king. And when it looks like Satan's winning, he's not going to win, because God will frustrate Satan's plans. No matter how hard men rage against God, they only end up furthering God's plans through their angry attacks on Christians and on Christ. He's even able to use God, the most unlikely people, to rescue his people. I mean, think about this. It's the Philistines and their attacks against Israel that God is using to deliver his servant David. As Christians, stories like this remind us of God's amazing ability to keep the promise he made in Romans 8:28 to us. God causes all things to work out for the good of his people. And ultimately, God will cause all things to work out for the good and glory of his messianic king. God's protection of David, what God's doing for David, points forward to what God is doing and will do for the much greater king, Jesus. God will place Jesus on the throne. He was able to get David on the throne in spite of Saul's angry attacks, and he will place Jesus on that throne. Jesus is on the throne, but we will see Jesus on that throne with all of his enemies defeated. And the book of Samuel, one of its purposes is to get us longing and get us hoping and get us anticipating that great day. Now, we're not finished Samuel yet. We're just here finishing up 1 Samuel, and we'll do that in our next video. So come on back.